The Biden administration has made a big stimulus payment to the citizens of America. The Trump administration before that did the same. How is that translated into economic activity, consumption, income? We're going to talk about that right now with Jeff Snider, the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. Jeff, we're going to be discussing an article that you posted at Alhambra Investments on March 26th. The title was Data Downgrading Uncle Sam's Helicopter. I guess you're referencing the helicopter money, helicopter drops, and it sounds like you don't believe it's going to be the stimulus that we need to prime the pump and get this machine moving.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to start with, Emil, is that the theory behind these things, well, first of all, I mean, look, the government paying people because of what happened last year in the economy, I mean, that's probably needed to happen. In fact, it really did need to happen because, the economy was broken through a series of miscalculations and through no fault of the poor workers who have been on the wrong end of this. So for the government to give them some sort of stipend or aid as a moral issue, there's no problem there. I think where we started to get into argument and debate and really pull this thing apart is whether we should call it stimulus or not. And the theory behind stimulus is, as you alluded to, John Maynard Keynes' pump priming was that, look, we throw some money in the economy and that while the economy is in recession, to reduce the level of recession, to keep the contraction to a minimum until recovery takes place. And in fact, it helps recovery takes place because in theory, consumers are spending the money that they get, which helps the recovery process because service providers have to provide more services, goods producers have to produce more goods for the spending, and that means they're going to start hiring again, and all of the virtuous circle of recovery takes place because the government has injected all of this money into the real economy.
That seems entirely plausible in an economy that doesn't suffer from permanent shocks or unit roots, which we've discussed before. And when we talked about it, we of course reference Milton Friedman, which we will again, when discussing positive economics and permanent income hypothesis. Tell us a little bit about Milton Friedman and these economic terms that I just referenced.
Well, as you just said, first of all, before we get to that, I mean, positive or permanent economic shocks are not something economists consider. And so for economists, the Neo-Keynesians who are advising the Treasury Department about what they should do, they don't believe that there's any such thing as a permanent shock. And so to them, this is standard stimulus stuff. Hey, there's a recovery coming because the recoveries always come. And then, what happened in 2008? Don't ask us. So for economists, permanent shocks aren't possible. So this is just standard dogma where the government pays people, consumption goes back up, consumption rises more than it would have, and that starts off the recovery that they know, or at least they think they know, is always going to come or follow along.
Right, but now we're not having that because there was a permanent shock. And so there's this sprinkling, these alms that are given, and consumers say, okay, I've got this windfall. I might spend some of it, but I know we went through a shock. Even though I'm not a fancy mathematician and I don't even know what a unit root is, I know the world has changed, and therefore I'm not going to change my behavior because my income has been affected. And this is not going to assist us. And that was first brought up in 1957, right?
Yeah, Milton Friedman came up with the permanent income hypothesis, which is really what you just described. I mean, people they don't understand the data, or they don't pay attention to the data. They don't go into deep dives of econometric models or anything like that. But they certainly perceive for their own purposes what's going on in the real economy, especially the labor market. Because why the labor market? Because labor is your source of steady income. And even if you're not one of the unfortunate multitudes of millions who have been laid off and put out of work, you could still be infected because you hear your cousins talk about, your neighbors, your friends, they got laid off or they're worried that, and it could also be that you think, well, I'm not going to get a raise anytime soon, or I'm not going to get a promotion, or I'm stuck at a job I hate. Any number of negative factors that you perceive that either change your perception of what you should do as a consumer, or even interrupt all of the processes that you normally think about when deciding how to consume as a baseline. And that's really what Milton Friedman was trying to get at, was what does a consumption baseline or permanent consumption curve look like? And what he said was, look, transitory, he used the word transitory, which we love around here. He used the word transitory income, either positive or negative, a transitory income, a windfall or a temporary job loss, something like that, doesn't actually change a consumer's permanent permanent consumption behavior, because they treat it as, when it's the case of a positive payment, they treat it as a windfall. They realize, I'm not going to get paid again, so I'm not going to behave as if I'm going to get this money all the time. I mean, it makes more intuitive sense than pretty much anything economists have ever come up with.
Well, let me read a quote of his. I think that's what you were just saying. Here's what he says. The purpose of these remarks is not to demonstrate that a zero correlation is the only plausible assumption. Its purpose is rather to show that common observation does not render it absurd to suppose that a hypothesis embodying a zero correlation can yield a fairly close approximation to observed consumer behavior. It's complicated, but I think that's just what we were saying.
Well, it's the econometric statistical way of saying essentially that. But what he really said there was essentially all of the problems with econometric models since then. What he said was there wasn't a zero correlation. And when he's talking about zero correlation, what he meant was transitory income and permanent consumption. What he said is, yeah, it's kind of a zero correlation, which is that, people treat a windfall and they don't necessarily do much. They don't alter their consumption baseline because of it. But it's not zero. It's non-zero. Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room there, and into that little bit of wiggle room has charged all of the stuff that we see nowadays when economists said, well, maybe there are certain conditions where we can introduce a windfall and goose the multiplier a little bit by quantitative easing alongside of it to make people feel happy about it. And so, Friedman was saying, yeah, maybe it's not a zero correlation, but it's close enough to be zero that maybe you shouldn't count on windfalls as a way to really stimulate beyond any short-run impacts.
I'm quoting you. Friedman argued that it wasn't much. Later, especially Neo-Keynesians like to fatten their multipliers considerably more. A good example is playing out right now before our American and European eyes, and I'm going to pull up a chart and you walk us through it, Jeff. It's about the income, receipts, and then without transfers, and then consumption.
Yeah, real personal income excluding transfers, the red line here. What that shows you is essentially private economy income, including proprietary sources, but mostly wages and salaries derived from work. The fat orange line is the personal income in nominal terms, which includes every possible source. As you can see, the big jumps up in 2020 and then again at the end of 2020, which were the Trump administration's payment. We don't have the latest one in the data. This is data just up through February of 2021. And if Friedman was wrong, then we would expect the dashed green line, which represents real personal consumption expenditures, or PCE, would follow along more closely the orange rather than the red. But what you can see here is that it has followed the red almost exactly, which suggests, as Friedman said, that there may be close to a zero correlation. Now, as we can see, especially in January of 2021, it's not a zero correlation, because that rise in spending in January definitely came about because of the $600 payment that the Trump administration ended with. So there are short-run effects. But even here in the data, we don't see that much of a short-run effect. And the fact that the spending follows income rather closely suggests further that for any more stimulus payments, including the $1,400 that's just been done, we maybe should downgrade our assessment of it, because I don't think that Friedman was actually wrong, especially about the long run. In the intermediate and longer term, there really isn't any correlation between short-term payments and long-run consumption.
Let me quote you. This is and remains a highly sick economy that not from COVID any longer, that cannot be fixed by transitory contributions. I've been saying that for a long time. I feel that what we need is a new social contract, a serious reevaluation of the relationship between businesses, the wealthy, regular households, and government, a new deal of some sort. And this tinkering is just not going to help. And I think that's what you're saying here, in a sense. I don't want to put words in your mouth. The overall issue then is entirely, quote unquote, stimulus and what to expect from it. Quite simply, not much, never much, as the data above shows once again, until the labor market is fixed, all else is just transitory conversation as well as small consumption. And it makes me think of the Hartz reforms in Germany. That was a social contract, a recent successful social contract where there was a very large proportion of unemployed for Germany, 10% or so, and they instituted reforms, and now there's much less unemployment. Now there are costs for that, but the point is it can be done. It was done recently, but we need some sort of national agreement, conversation that there's something big wrong, not just COVID, trade wars.
Yeah, there's much deeper problems here, and they're proving to be intractable. And as you know, Friedman already said, look, temporary transitory payments aren't going to do much for you outside the short run. And economists have said, well, yeah, that's the whole point. It's a short run stimulus until we get to recovery. So we have to realize what Friedman was saying, as well as the fact that we have experienced permanent shocks, and therefore the short run thinking, given the permanent shock, is just we're not just wasting money, we're wasting time. And time is the biggest problem against us at this point, is because this is not just a COVID story. It's not just a trade war story. This has been going on for a very long time already, and not just in the United States. This is a global problem where suddenly growth just magically disappeared during the first global financial crisis. It's something we need to consider. And it's not something that governments anywhere, no matter how big of the checks they write, they're going to be able to get us out of it. As Lacey Hunt pointed out, look, Japan's been doing this much longer than we have. They've got 30 years of experience if we draw upon it. We can't just ignore it because we think, oh, the Japanese screwed up because they're Japanese. We should look at the similarities, which are legion, and say, why are we doing all the same policies? Why are we following all the same programs and mimicking the results too, and still not making the connection there?
Well, Jeff, I very much enjoyed this particular episode. I know our audience is going to find it educational, hopefully entertaining, and I wanted to thank you, and I'll talk to you again in a week.
Yeah, see you next week, Emil.